I have a problem. It could be some kind of medical problem. It's definitely a financial problem. Maybe even it's a moral problem. A deficiency in my character. I love retro gaming consoles. And not just the real old ones, but all the new old ones as well. Of course, I have all these mini consoles like the NES Mini, the Genesis Mini, the TurboGrafx-16 Not So Mini, the Astro City Mini, but it's not enough, ladies and gentlemen. I have a cartridge-shaped hole in my heart, and I think it could be time to fill it so that I don't die from ischemia. And I think I found just the medicine that I need. In 2020, Blaze Entertainment, a company that in the past was known for manufacturing retro handheld devices for other companies, released a cartridge-based handheld video game console of their very own, the Evercade. And very quickly, the Evercade became the belle of the ball. Isn't she pretty? And some people really loved it, while other people just absolutely hated it. While the Evercade successfully recaptured the magic of collecting physical media in giant plastic clamshell cases, with, I might add, full color instructions manuals. That's just beautiful, man. The Evercade also presented a number of quality issues. What? Cartridges were fitting too tightly. Games had sound issues. No. The screen wasn't bright enough. The buttons were mapped incorrectly. Unforgivable! While the Evercade was scoring real cred with critics, the general public and Joe from GameSack were not so impressed. But the people at Blaze weren't sitting idle. They fixed the problems with the first run of hardware, such as the cartridge issues. They issued a firmware patch that removed the audio problems and increased the screen brightness. And best of all, fixed the button mapping issues, allowing players to choose from a series of alternatives. But still, though I love this idea, I love retro games and the promise of real physical media, I balked. I said, no way, dude. 2 reasons. First of all, for our family, I've found that video games really need to be a social activity in order to both keep gaming in its place and maintain a peaceful order. All of my fondest memories of gaming have been social, like the time my brother and I played Phantasy Star 2 every day after school until we finally beat it. We were the cool kids. And absolutely destroying my kids in Smash Brothers as Samus Aran. Or watching my kids create their own Roblox videos. I'm so proud. My worst memories of gaming have been watching people fight over controllers, who gets to play, or watching people languish deep into addiction and isolation.
We needs it, precious. We loves it.
So we like to keep gaming social.
Family fun?
But the Evercade is a handheld console that does not promote multiplayer opportunities, and therefore, it is an object of pure evil. Reason number 2, the games just didn't appeal to me. Evercade games come in nifty little collections focused on a retro developer or game publisher. For instance, here's the Namco Collection Volume 1. You get Battle Cars, never heard of it. Dig Dug, nice. Galaxian, cool. Little Rabble, no clue. Mappy Kids, hey. Metal Marines, wait a minute. Pac-Man, these are the NES ports, stop everything. These are the home versions of these games, NES games, and I've never heard of half of these. The same issue has plagued most every cartridge. The Data East collection had Bad Dudes, Bump and Jump, Burger Time, all classics, but they were all the home console versions. And not that that's always a bad thing. Midnight Resistance for the Sega Genesis is what the experts like to call a hidden gem. Just listen to that music. But the thing is, a Data East collection should be arcade titles in my opinion. And again, a lot of these other games on these collections are kinda iffy. Side Pocket? Karate Champ? Really?
Yeah.
But that's all changed now. Earlier in 2021, the Evercade announced a new multiplayer-ready console version of the Evercade that will allow up to 4-player game support by way of conventional controller ports. The Evercade VS, which should be out in November of this year for about $100. That's great! Even better, Evercade has been very responsive to criticism, and they're packing the new Evercade with arcade collections of games, including a Data East collection, which means now you can play the real bad dudes.
Hey, I thought we were the real bad dudes. Yeah, man, what gives?
And there's the much beloved arcade version of Burger Time too,
Which is very cool.
This is all enough to make me very interested in an Evercade VS. But now I think I essentially have no choice in the matter. That's because Blaze recently announced that early in 2022, there is going to be a Renovation collection.
A what collection?
Renovation. Renovation was an American subsidiary of a Japanese video game developer called Telenet, sometimes Nihon Telenet, which developed and produced a wide variety of games for Japanese computers, the PC Engine, and the Sega Genesis throughout the 1980s and into the early 1990s. They were known for their heavy reliance on animated cutscenes and a persistent attempt to generate multimedia branding around their magical, beautiful anime girls. They were also famous for producing exceptionally good game music. And occasionally, some of their games would be playable, even good sometimes.
Wow!
Telenet games were always a little dodgy and unpolished, but every now and then they'd produce legitimate gaming magic. And there was no place where Telenet excelled more than on the Sega Genesis. And that's what we have here. Renovation was set up to publish Telenet games for the Sega Genesis in the United States of America. And in the early years of the Sega Genesis, they did a lot to help add to the feeling that owning the console was the right thing to do.
Welcome to the cool kids, dude. Now give me your lunch money so we can buy cigarettes.
Every society has its form of taxation. Between 1990 and 1992, Renovation imported and published an incredible 22 Genesis games. What the Evercade is getting is 12 of these 22 Sega Genesis games, representing nearly every game that was natively developed in-house by Telenet. Certain games published by Renovation, like the space shooters Whip Rush and Arrow Flash, were actually developed by other companies. In this case, Vic Tokai and ITL respectively. In fact, only 2 Renovation games published in the US that were also developed by Telenet are missing from this collection. Cid of Valis, which looks really cool, but believe me, is one of the worst games Renovation ever published. And a little bit creepy given that it appears to sexualize a child. Appears to. I'm not accusing anybody. Officers, you know what to do. And the other missing game is, of course, Ernest Evans, the greatest adventurer in the world. Flail around vigorously with Ernest Evans, the super rubbery explorer, and sometimes macho boyfriend to this magical girl with green hair. Explore the deep dark caves, get away from the boulders, ride the train, toot toot, and try and keep from laughing when this happens. Or this. But what in the heck is even going on? Yes, they decided to leave out Ernest Evans, which is one of the most unintentionally funny action games ever made. I say one of so as to express intellectual caution, but let's be real, this is the funniest game ever. I mean, just look at it. So that leaves us with 12 Sega Genesis games on this Evercade cartridge. Let's just look at the lineup. Going in alphabetical order, we start with Arcus Odyssey from 1990, a game that I personally had and which I played a lot as a kid. Telenet had a lot of long-running franchises that started on Japanese PCs in the mid-80s, and the Arcus series is just one of them. Now, Arcus on the PC was a traditional turn-based RPG, but Arcus Odyssey for the Sega Genesis is actually an overhead action game that mimics a dungeon crawler or action RPG in terms of its presentation. For instance, you'll constantly be unlocking scattered treasure chests to help you stay alive. But in reality, this game is a lot more like a fast-paced run and gun, with a fantasy setting. Each level is a mini dungeon filled with monsters. The game looks good, has incredible music, but can also be frustrating to navigate since there's no in-game map and I used to get lost all the time. In fact, I still do.
Hello? Hello? Is this Chuck E. Cheese? Where am I?
Unfortunately, this game's biggest weakness is its repetitiveness. But making up for that is the fact that this game offers 2-player simultaneous co-op. This is a pretty good Genesis game, and I've always enjoyed it. Looks like we're off to a really good start. So curb your expectations, because the next game on the Renovation collection is Beast Wrestler. Beast Wrestler is easily the most despised game on this collection. It's one of the few games included here that I've never owned or rented myself in the 90s. But I've seen reviews online, and search as I may, no one likes it. I think the problem is that while it's got all these fantasy monsters that you can choose from, it's essentially a wrestling sim, and 16-bit wrestling games typically have a pretty stiff learning curve. Like, you gotta take a class or something. People probably tried to play this like a beat-em-up or a regular fighting game and got stuck not knowing what to do. Hopefully, Blaze will come through with an excellent color manual, as they did with other Evercade games, and that it provides a listing of the moves. Further, I don't think very many people realize how deep this game can go. As you win fights, you can go to a shop and get items to customize your monster, and eventually you fuse your monster with other types to change its attributes. I suspect there's a complex game here that might reward those who stick it out. Or it could just all be a dull, repetitive piece of trash with the worst hit detection I have ever seen in a video game. Either way, at least 2 people can suffer this together, making it perfect for the Evercade VS. Next is Dino Land, which is the 3rd and final 2-player game included on this compilation. But since it's a pinball sim, it's not really a 2-player co-op game. But it is nice with super cute dinosaurs and good music. It's just that there isn't a lot that happens in this game. There are only 3 unique boards, and while each have enough variety to justify playing this, and I sincerely enjoyed it, fans of video pinball games like Devil's Crush would have been very disappointed in this game back in 1991. I still like this game though, in small short bursts. Next is El Viento, part 1 of the so-called Annette Furutabi trilogy, and the prequel to Ernest Evans, the greatest adventurer in the world! Yes, Ernest Evans is part of a trilogy of games, and of that trilogy, El Viento is by far the best. I'm not saying it's amazing, mind you, I'm just saying it's not this. El Viento, which is Spanish for the wind, is maybe the strangest game Telenet ever developed for the Sega Genesis. And as you know by now, that's really saying something. El Viento stars a Japanese magical girl with green hair and super boomerang powers, who has to fight Al Capone and his gang in 1920s Prohibition-era America, who are part of an evil plot that has something to do with Cthulhu and H.P. Lovecraft. Drugs are illegal in Japan. I've got nothing. The first level features a battle with the mob. As you navigate a labyrinth of tall American city buildings, watch out for the exploding girls on motorcycles. And these cars that chase you down. You know, it's a normal walk in New York City, baby. Then you're off to Mount Rushmore, where thank goodness there's trampolines and this happens. From the makers of Ernest Evans, ladies and gentlemen. What else did we expect? Now I'm making fun, but the truth is, El Viento is a very fun and fast-paced action game that ultimately I think is worth most people's time. But it is very hard. Like many Telenet games, the animated cutscenes and music in this game are excellent. It's a shame that Annette Furutabi never got her own anime spin-off or themed Magic Girl Cafe in Tokyo. But I am grateful to God that they didn't do to her what they did to Valis. But we'll talk about that later. The next game is Exile, a very strange, very short action RPG that was originally made for Japanese computers. In fact, Exile is actually known in Japan as Exer 2, XZR2. I see why they changed the name. It didn't have any vowels. You play as Sadler, a Syrian desert warrior who single-handedly fights evil Christian crusaders. And stuff. The story in the Sega Genesis version has been heavily censored to remove references to the Crusades, Templars, and the quasi-historical setting that this game is aiming to couch itself in. But that's okay because this fantastical game is only historical in the loosest possible sense of the word. It's not. Also removed are references to drugs, a scene where villagers are crucified and burned alive, and some 16-bit video game nudity.
If you want to see all that cool stuff, then you need to play the PC Engine CD version, dude. I'm there, dude.
It's in Japanese.
Oh man, bummer.
Overall, this is a pretty hard game to recommend. It's heavily text-based, so you have to read through a lot of character dialogue and plot, but it's an incomprehensible mess. And since Exile is actually the second entry in a 3-part series, I can't help but think I'm seriously missing some critical information. The gameplay between lengthy dialogue and town exploring is that of a side-scrolling action platformer, but the controls, pacing, and hit detection are all quite sloppy. Gameplay, as with most Telenet games, was plainly secondary to cool anime cutscenes and convoluted storytelling. And though I said this game is an RPG, it only kinda sort of is. It's also 100% linear. And it sounds like I hate this, but as a kid I loved this game. It had absolutely awesome music, cool characters and graphics, and it's also sort of easy, especially if you figure out how to farm experience points in dungeons. And while my adult brain doesn't understand the story or characters, this game's incomprehensibility tricked my baby brain into thinking there was something profound hidden behind this game's wacky dialogue. It's like a David Lynch movie or something. It has to mean something, right? I like this mess of a game, but people who aren't nostalgic for it probably won't. Just saying. Next is Final Zone, another game I absolutely loved as a kid in the 90s that most people aren't necessarily going to like now. In this game, you get to pilot a badass giant fighting robot in isometric run-and-gun levels filled with endlessly repeating backgrounds and finitely repeating enemies. Blow up everything with your customizable arsenal, and then fight a fun boss fight and move on. The music and boss fights are great. Customizing your weapon is great, but the regular levels are kinda long and repetitive. Final Zone is a really great addition to this collection, even if I can't quite call it a great game on its own merits. But then there's Gaiares, a side-scrolling space shooter from 1990. It's one of the best side-scrolling space shooters on the Sega Genesis, and it's also probably the hardest. Gaiares showcases some amazing artwork and level design, and while it follows R-Type's basic gameplay formula with this option that rotates around your ship, there is the unique addition of being able to use that option to steal weapons or attack patterns from enemies on screen. This adds a lot to the routine shmup gameplay and keeps you experimenting with all of the different types of attacks that could be hidden in each level. There's only about a dozen or so of them, but it's enough to keep you engaged. And so is the painful difficulty. Interviews with the developers in recent years, thanks largely to an incredible book called The Untold History of Japanese Game Developers, reveals that the US version of Guyeras had an artificially ramped up difficulty due to the American tendency to both rent or purchase resold games. It was thought by the producers at Telenet that increasing the difficulty would make people want to either own or hold on to their copy of the game to beat it, and therefore protect retail sales in stores. That was the theory. In practice, what we got was a game so hard that almost everybody got stuck on the second level before dumping it forever. This is a shame because this is a really great game and probably the single best Telenet game that I've ever played, and therefore the best game on this Renovation collection. Sadly, it's not perfect. Some of the awesome boss fights are simply recycled later on, and the arbitrary difficulty spike and having to finish most of a level all over again without any power-ups, if you die, make for a relatively unfair experience. But if you're up to mastering it, then you can be as cool as this guy. Jamie Bunker, professional gamer.
Whoa, who's this guy?
Yeah, he's awesome. When Jamie says Gaiares really smokes, we believe him. That's because Jamie has been a professional video game tester since he was 12. And when we introduced Jamie to the 8 meg power and 3-way scrolling graphics of Gaiares, he was blown away.
Guyeras is #1 according to Jamie Bunker.
Can you say Gaiares? Say it with me. Gaiares. The critics say Gaiares is awesome. Jamie Bunker happens to agree. So forget about that Thor Åkerlund and his wimpy-ass NES World Championship and bow before the real master, the master of Guyeras. I mean, Gaiares. Jamie the Mullet Bunker. The next game is Granada by Wolf Team, one of Telenet's development teams. There was Lasersoft, Riot, Reno, but the best of all was always Wolf Team. In fact, roughly half of the games on this collection were made by Wolf Team. So how is Granada? It's another banger.
That means it's good.
And it's quite unique. An overhead 4-way scrolling tank shooter with large, fairly complex levels and exceptional controls and playability. You're equipped with a radar-style map that indicates your primary targets. Eliminate all of the targets within the time limit and unlock a challenging but fun boss fight. The only drawback to this game is that its color palette and art style is pretty bland, and so too are the enemies you face. But the gameplay is really tight and addictive. On those technical merits alone, this really ought to be my pick for the best Renovation published game on this compilation, especially considering how the music, like virtually all Telenet games, totally kicks ass. But I can't. It's good, but may I remind you that according to Jamie Bunker, Gaiares is #1. In fact, Dr. Dave, no, not that Dave, the guy from GamePro. Once Dr. Dave got his hands on the 8 meg fighting power of Gaiares, he gave it a perfect score and stated,
"Novice space jockeys need not apply."
Electronic Gaming Monthly was so impressed with Gaiares they couldn't put it down, and now they're out of business. Coincidence?
No way, dude. They're done, dog.
Games don't get any better than this. If you thought the lava in Banjo-Tooie was intense, then wait until you see the next game, which is Sol Dees, a 1992 version of the Sega CD launch game Soul Feast by Wolf Team. Who in the heck is in charge of naming this stuff? And yes, it's yet another banger.
That's good, dog.
After playing Gaiares and Granada, this comes off initially as a somewhat pedestrian side-scrolling space shooter, but the levels are nicely varied with unique challenges constantly coming your way, and you have the option to play around with the angle of your cannons, which is of course mandatory at critical strategic moments. I like it when space shooters give me a little bit of extra control. It makes me feel like I'm in control, like I'm more of a man. If you've ever played Gaiares, then you know what to expect here. Constantly flying your spaceship to the right. Dodge anything that isn't your spaceship, except power-ups. You need to hit those. And never stop shooting until everything is exploded. This game is fun, but it's also really hard. But not even close to being as hard as Gaiares. And on top of that, it's only 6 levels long, and once again, and you're not going to believe this, the music is awesome. In fact, the music was done by Motoi Sakuraba, who modern gamers probably know for his seminal work in Mario Golf Super Rush for the Nintendo Switch. But he also composed the music for Granada, Final Zone, this game, Sol Dees, Arcus Odyssey, remember that? And El Viento, the wind. That's like half of the games on here, and the music in all of them is awesome. But you know what's not awesome? The next game, according to the whole world at least. Let's talk about Treasure, a 1992 RPG that gravely disappointed me back when I bought it from my local grocery store for $5. Probably around 1994 or so.
Grocery store?
Does anyone else remember when grocery stores got into the video game rental business for a few years early in the 90s? Well, many did, and included in our store's listing was an assortment of video games, including Treasure. Eventually, the rise of Blockbuster and Hollywood Video meant my grocery store's video section would be turned back into a giant pyramid of Bud Light. But before that happened, They liquidated their inventory, and that's how I wound up with Treasure. Now I love JRPGs, especially back then, when I had my whole life to waste in front of me, and especially on the Sega Genesis. I even love JRPGs that everyone else hates, such as Sword of Vermilion and Phantasy Star 3. So what did I think of Treasure? Well, I love the introductory cutscene and music. Once again, Telenet could have been an anime studio with their awesome cinematic sensibilities here, but I could never get this game off the ground. Eventually, I'd get bored and just shelve it as a bitter disappointment. Re-examining it now and listening to a bunch of reviews, I'm thinking a little differently. I'm thinking that Treasure is just misunderstood. Sure, compared to Phantasy Star 4 and Shining Force, Treasure lacks flavor or personality. Alright, I'll admit it. Compared to plain non-fat yogurt, Treasure lacks flavor or personality. It's like something someone made in RPG Maker. It's like the template for all RPGs before you add characters, a story, or in-game magic. But, did you consider that Treasure has awesome music? It really does. Just check out this music from the item shop. And did you also consider the fact that Treasure has horrifically clunky and confusing menus to navigate? And long drawn-out battles? Or its ugly graphics? Did you consider any of this? Oh, you did? Well, fine, but I still don't think it's that bad. After looking at it again and comparing it to Beast Wrestler, this is just an average game that I don't really like, even though I desperately want to love it. The last two games in the Renovation collection are very special to a lot of people. Nerds, otaku, hardcore gamers, anime geeks, Japanese salarymen, and some sex offenders. Sometimes all of the above. Absolutely love the Valis series. The Valis series goes all the way back to the PC-88 and MSX home computers in 1986. It featured copious amounts of cutscenes depicting the story of Yuko, a 16-year-old schoolgirl who has been chosen to wield a magical sword called Valis, in order to save not just our world, but also the world of dreams. No, not those dreams, but the dreams of creepy older men which prominently feature 16-year-old schoolgirls dressed like this. As you can see, the original game had everything except good gameplay. But after being remade a number of times, finally in 1991 an almost good version of the original Valis game, Valis the Phantasm Soldier, was finally made. And that's one of the two Valis games included here. This version of the game featured greatly enhanced graphics and sound over its predecessors. In fact, the first level has possibly my favorite song in any Sega Genesis game ever. Just listen to this. But as you can see, while Yuko can jump higher than Michael Jordan in Space Jam, she runs like she's waist deep in water. This is the Sega Genesis in 1991. Doesn't she know that she's gotta go fast? Come on, Yuko, you can do it. Overall, in spite of its obvious flaws, I really like this game, and I consider it my favorite version of the original Valis by far. Now, most people would disagree with me, and they'd point to the late remake for the PC Engine CD-ROM in 1992 as the best version, and possibly the best version of any Valis game ever. But that version also goes out of its way to constantly showcase Yuko as a sexual object, including showing her underwear every time she jumps in the game. Features that only go farther in cementing Valis' reputation as a game for and by weirdo perverts. And can I remind you, Yuko here is a 16-year-old girl.
Not cool, dude.
It's with this in mind that I defer to the Sega Genesis version. It's not as tight in the controls, but I actually like the graphical style and the awesome chiptunes. And while I'm not really a prude, I'm really not. Valis in the Genesis game avoids stepping over my line. It does get uncomfortably close, but my conscience remains clear. Finally, the last game included here is yet another entry in the Valis series, and it's actually my favorite out of all the Valis games ever made. And there were a lot of them. There were about 6 different versions of the original game, and each one was completely different from the other in terms of level design and gameplay. This was also true of Valis II, which had about 6 different versions, including the horrific Cid of Valis that was apparently rejected for this Renovation collection. It's also no longer allowed within 500 feet of schools or playgrounds. And so it went with Valis III, which appeared on both the Sega Genesis and the TurboGrafx CD. The games are similar, and yet totally different. Valis 4 would show up on both the PC Engine CD and the Super Nintendo, and these two games are even more divergent from each other. And then there was Valis X, a series of pornographic interactive graphic novels, featuring characters from the Valis series. Published in 2006 by Telenet, this could have been a desperate last-ditch attempt to save Telenet before it went out of business forever in 2007. Or, given the nature of this content and its conjunction with a high school girl, it could be what one might call retribution. But let's try and forget about all that and focus on Valis 3, the greatest Valis game of all time. Yuko is back, and this time she starts off in her pajamas. Oh god, no. Which are 100% tasteful and not what you're thinking. So she's running around in her pink pajamas because this other girl with a whip. Oh god, no! Calm down. This isn't that kind of Valis game. Everything's cool in this one, alright? You have my word. Alright, fine. Carry on. Just let me lock the door in case my kids walk in. Valis is some weird shit, man. Indeed it is. So this chick with a whip shows up and she steals Valis. That's the magical sword. So Yuko chases her down, but it turns out she's a good guy and she just needed to borrow it. But then the real bad guy shows up and kidnaps Whip Girl. So Whip Girl throws the sword at Valis, and then this happens. That's awesome. So you fight Magic Emperor Galleon and rescue Whip Girl, and now for the rest of the game you can play as her if you want to. In the next level you save another girl, Magic Wand Girl, and your party is thus complete. Each character has their own unique strengths and abilities, and being able to interchange them as you play really adds a lot to the gameplay. The controls are decent, the graphics are pretty cool, and once again, do I even need to say it? The music is phenomenal. Telenet really had a great music team. After Castlevania Bloodlines, Valis 3 is easily the second best Castlevania game on the Sega Genesis. Seriously though, the Valis games really sort of play like Castlevania, especially this one. Not that that's a bad thing. If you ever play one out of the something like 16 different non-pornographic Valis games that were released by Telenet in the 80s and 90s, then this is definitely the one to play. Like a lot of successful Japanese developers from the 80s and 90s, Telenet really struggled with the 3D revolution of the mid-90s, and by 2007 saddled with more than $1 billion in debt, and despite transforming a beloved franchise into vile smut, Nihon Telenet was no more. Their IPs were owned for a time by Sunsoft, who sold their games on Nintendo's Virtual Console. Then at some point the Telenet game license was sold again, and as of today they are now owned by a company called Idea. And it's Idea that's working with Blaze, the maker of the Evercade, to make this Renovation collection a reality. So what are the odds that's actually going to happen in a way that's satisfying? I don't know much about Idea. They're mainly a Japanese mobile gaming company, and I've never played any of their products, nor am I familiar with their track record. But it's not like they're gonna do anything more than just dump ROMs they get off the internet and put it on a cartridge. They own the intellectual property, but I highly doubt they have anything like source code for this material. So that means the heavy lifting will most likely fall to Blaze. and their proprietary Evercade cartridges. The good news is that the Evercade has already seen a fairly wide selection of Mega Drive and Sega Genesis games. Midnight Resistance, as part of the First Data East collection, looks and sounds great on the Evercade. And it's the sound, for me, that's going to be the critical issue here, because as you most certainly know by now, it's the music in these Renovation games that really matters most to me. And obviously, I don't need the ROMs to hear the music from these games. In fact, I'm listening to the Treja soundtrack right now as I write this. But if the emulation for the audio isn't accurate or free of bugs and artifacts, then that's going to be a serious deal breaker regarding this collection. I'm still buying it, you know, for research purposes, but poorly emulated audio would be a real heartbreaking situation. And of course, I want the games to play well too, and there's definitely a ton of potential here. The Renovation collection will come with 12 games, and 6 of these games, in my opinion, are good. If you love side-scrolling space shooters, then you'll definitely love playing both Gaiares and Soldice. And you'll also probably love Granada, a true hidden gem from the Sega Genesis if there ever was one. If action platformers are more your thing, then Valis III and El Viento both have a lot to offer. And you might even get something out of Valis the Phantasm Soldier or the eccentric Exile. Some people really love these games despite their flaws. And you know, you might be one of them. And for 2-player simultaneous co-op, you really can't go wrong with Arcus Odyssey. I mean, prepare to get your ass kicked, but at the very least you get your ass kicked with a friend. And isn't that what the good life is all about? Getting your ass kicked with someone you love? I mean, you're guaranteed to get your ass kicked no matter what you want or do. You may as well do it together. Or you could play Beast Wrestler together. At the very least, it's kind of funny. For a few minutes. Or maybe every day after school you can make progress on Treja, the blandest RPG ever made. It's not as good as Dino Land or Final Zone, but at least it has really good music. So that's the Renovation collection for the Evercade. Did you guys play any of these games back in the day? They weren't exactly blockbusters, and they were frequently in the discount bin, which explains why I actually owned so many of them. But they're also really fun, especially if you choose the right ones. What do you think of the Evercade and its quirky but compelling business model? Let us know this and more in the comments. And as always, it is an honor and a privilege to be able to talk about video games with you. Thank you very much for watching, and we hope that you have a blessed day. Bye-bye now.